Death. It is, for most people, the ultimate mystery. Certainly, it is the most terrifying. The knowledge that sooner or later each of us will die distinguishes us from every other creature on the planet.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
We confront the inevitable with rituals that comfort us by defining a boundary between life and death.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
We vent our grief, say farewell, and begin the return to life's routines. But the rituals of death are not just for the living.
They're largely about assisting the person who has died in making a voyage to a new place, to the place of the dead, to heaven, to perhaps reincarnation, whatever it might be.
When in our evolution did we first realize that all must die and that death might not be the end? The earliest clues are prehistoric. Tens of thousands of years ago, before we learned to farm or write, we buried our dead with ritual.
We don't know the very earliest earth burials, but there are certainly some earth burials that go back at least 40 or 44,000 years, and more recently archaeologists have found some that go back much beyond that.
Despite the enormous gulf of time, archaeologists have found clear signs of concerns much like our own.
They must have had a reverence and a respect for the dead, because fossilized remains of plants and leaves and moss remain in these graves, suggesting that they made some provision so that the graves would be comfortable.
In sites throughout Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists have uncovered a tantalizing mystery. Bodies have been found in the fetal or flexed position. Were bodies folded only to make them easier to bury? Fragments of pigment indicate that a red clay called ochre was sometimes smeared on them. This may be the key unlocking the ancient mystery of our earliest beliefs.
This red ochre was probably symbolic of blood, and that when babies are born, they are not infrequently covered in blood, and that by burying the body with the red ochre, this was somehow symbolic of a new birth.
New birth, a life after death. Exactly when this idea first appeared remains a mystery. There is, however, spectacular evidence of how and why one ancient people developed their death rituals. Nearly 5,000 years have passed since the Egyptians began creating their unique artifacts of death. And still they fascinate us. Mummies. Mummies are whole, preserved bodies wrapped in linen. Under the linen, their flesh, though dried and withered, is intact. Their features are clear, their personalities distinct. Perhaps that is why they intrigue us so deeply.
I think it's that you're looking at a person across 3,000–4,000 years. This is a recognizable human being, just like you, and he lived 4,000 years ago. There's something special about that.
The pyramids were built as tombs, but only for the mummies of some of Egypt's pharaohs. Most mummies were buried in underground vaults and chambers carved into rock walls. Almost all ancient Egyptians were mummified in an attempt to achieve everlasting life. They believed that if their bodies could be preserved, they would live again.
Immortality was available to everybody. Everybody wanted a shot at immortality. The poor man, who couldn't afford an embalmer, say, was probably wrapped in a linen sheet and just buried in a mass grave.
Mummification for the upper classes was elaborate and very effective. Although the techniques are often said to be steeped in mystery, research has revealed much about them.
In mummification, the basic principle is to dehydrate the body, to get rid of as much moisture as you can.
One of the first steps in drying out the body was removing organs. The stomach, the liver, the intestines, the kidneys were placed in separate jars to be magically reunited with the body in the next life. But why was the heart left in the body?
They thought that you thought with your heart. When you get excited, it's your heart that beats quickly, not your brain. So the heart was left inside the body, because when you got to the next world, you would need to think, to say the magical words, to reassemble everything and get going.
The brain was useless, and it was a source of moisture, so it had to be disposed of.
They had a long instrument, a copper or bronze instrument, looks a little bit like a coat hanger, that they inserted through the nostril, and they broke through a bone behind the eyes called the cribriform plate, and got into the cranium. Then they would take this instrument and move it around, very much like a whisk is used in the kitchen today, to break down the brain to almost a liquid state so that it could run out through the nostrils.
The drying process continued by packing the body in salt for a month or more. Then it was wrapped in linen and placed in its coffin. Since they would live again, the dead would need their possessions. The tombs of wealthy Egyptians were filled with the finest ceremonial weapons, furniture, and even game boards, complete with pieces. Pets were often mummified, killed and preserved so they could accompany their masters in the land of the dead. Achieving eternal life required more than just mummification. The famous Egyptian Book of the Dead prescribed the spells, the prayers, and the rites that had to be performed. Failure to follow these instructions would leave the body forever still and lifeless. One of the most intriguing rituals occurred just before the tomb was closed.
So at this moment of burial, the priest would touch the mouth and say, "You're young again, you live again, you're young again, you live again forever." It wasn't just the physical mummification that made immortality, it was the mummification plus the ritual.
What inspires belief and ritual? In the case of the Egyptians, it was Egypt itself, the physical environment. In ancient times, as now, all life depended on the Nile. The land alongside it is fertile and easily irrigated. But there is comparatively little of this precious soil. Most of Egypt is barren desert. None of the river land could be spared for disposal of the dead. In the earliest days of Egyptian civilization, long before any attempt at mummification, the bodies of the departed were buried in the desert. Archaeologists have discovered bodies here that are still intact despite the passage of over 12,000 years. They were embalmed by the desert itself.
In Egypt, if you put a body in the dry, hot sand, it'll dehydrate naturally. And as long as you get rid of the moisture quickly, you'll have a mummy, because bacteria need moisture to work on tissue.
With the passing of time and the shifting of the sands, there was a gruesome revelation. Ironically, It may have been this which inspired Egyptian belief in immortality.
If a body's buried in the sand, and eventually the sand's going to blow away, but if it's been dehydrated naturally, it's going to look like a person after 100, 200, 300 years. It's a recognizable human being. And if somebody sees that, he might get the idea that this thing doesn't end with death.
As their civilization developed, the Egyptians began to build tombs. But tombs kept the bodies from the dry desert sand. Mummification was a human attempt to duplicate the forces of nature. Ultimately, there was a further development in Egyptian belief. Ironically, it was inspired by grave robbers who came in search of treasure. They made a discovery which challenged traditional belief and changed it. The mummies, which should have literally and physically migrated to the land of the dead, were still there.
And then I think the religious belief became a little more abstract. It was perhaps merely that the soul would go west and the body would stay in the tomb forever.
Egypt's ancient rituals of death ended in the 3rd century of the Common Era, as Christianity replaced the old religion. But mummification continues as a surprising part of ritual elsewhere. Naples, Italy, lies at the foot of Mount Vesuvius, a volcano. The volcanic soil has a unique preserving effect. The dead are buried here without coffins, so the soil itself can embalm them. "18 to 24 months later, the bodies are dug up. The origin of this tradition is shrouded in mystery, but it was a well-established custom by Roman times. Nothing in Catholicism forbids it, and so it has endured to this day. Finally, the body is laid to rest in a family vault. Although many cultures and religions try to preserve the body, others insist it be cremated, destroyed by fire. Cremation is practiced throughout the world and in almost every era of human history. The ancient Greeks once buried their dead, but then turned to cremation around 1,000 years before the Common Era. No one knows why. In Viking Scandinavia, in Northern Europe, fallen heroes were often sent to sea on blazing ships. Was cremation a ritual all these different cultures developed independently?
One mystery about cremation that remains, and I don't think we will ever resolve, is really where it begins. Is there a place that cremation starts and then it spreads north, east, south, or west from there? The origination question, I don't suspect we'll ever fully answer.
The earliest evidence of cremations is in India, where the Hindu religion developed over 5,000 years ago. Hindus believe every soul will be reborn countless times in countless forms.
And so burning the body releases the spirit. That's at least the theory, that it releases the spirit, it releases the Atman, purifies it, and prepares it for a better rebirth.
The smoke moving up to heaven would get the attention of the deities, and so therefore the cremation of the individual would expedite the soul.
To non-believers, some aspects of these cremations may seem repellent. A grisly moment marks the liberation of the soul.
Sometime at the cremation ceremony, when the skull pops from the heat, this is sort of a signal that the spirit has now been released, and there's a great sense of relief among those who are there witnessing the cremation.
After the flames have done their work, the ashes are swept into the sacred Ganges.
The Ganges in the water is also seen as a sort of a goddess. So the placing of the ashes into the river is an immersion really into the goddess and into the purification that the goddess offers.
But how did cremation become the key to purification and rebirth for the Hindus? Did they cremate because they believed in releasing the spirit, or did the explanation come after the act?
Some people think that cremation might have begun with some sort of fire sacrifice or some sort of ritual that involved fire that wasn't supposed to be a death ritual, or maybe was a death ritual where the body just caught on fire by mistake and it was burned, and people said, oh, okay, well, that's one way to do it.
Is it possible one of the world's great religious practices was born of an accident? It is certain that the Hindu rites of death have changed over the years. For thousands of years, in some parts of India, cremation included a voluntary human sacrifice. The widow threw herself upon the funeral pyre to accompany her husband in death. The practice is called sati.
The iconography of sati in India, the images show the woman sitting on her husband's body, being consumed with flames and taking on the multi-armed image of a deity. So she somehow becomes divinized in the practice of sati itself.
There is evidence, however, that the widow was sometimes reluctant to achieve divinity in just this way.
It has been suggested that on some occasions she's thought better of this at the last moment, and that there were episodes where other relatives had to make the suggestion very strongly that she join him, and if she continued to cower by the side of the fire, she might even have been forcibly led to her duty.
The practice of sati was outlawed in 1829 by the British when they ruled India. Today, amazingly, though very rare, the forbidden ritual is still performed.
It seems to take place in pretty isolated rural villages, and it does seem to take place as an underground phenomenon. People will come and try to stop it, often, even in rural areas, and so it has to take place underground and to some extent in secret.
The three great Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, share a common belief in the sanctity of life and a belief that the human body is God's creation.
The time came when the Lord God formed a man's body from the dust of the ground and breathed into it the breath of life, and man became a living person. Genesis 2:7.
Orthodox Jews have always opposed cremation, and the reason they oppose it is because of their view of the human person. They see human beings as a mix of body and spirit. To burn the body is in some sense to violate the person, to be burning the person.
Cremation is never specifically condemned by the Bible. Over time, many Jews began to practice it, until a horrifying chapter in history began.
The one interesting transformation of Jewish attitudes towards cremation has occurred in the 20th century, and it has occurred as a result of the Holocaust, because cremation was a method that was used to kill in the concentration camps during World War II. And so the associations there are extremely negative. And so the trend among Jews, including Reform Jews, is very much now away from cremation.
Muslims, the followers of Islam, also prefer burial, so that a unique interrogation can take place when angels visit.
By tradition, the Muslims bury sufficiently deep that the individual in the casket could in fact sit up without their head appearing above the ground, so that they would be able to be questioned by these two angels.
The questions the Muslim angels ask test the dead man's knowledge of his religion.
And if the deceased answers well, then a door is broken in the side of the tomb, and he enters into the Garden of Paradise. If, however, he does not answer well, or does not know his religion well, he is beaten in a grisly way by the angels, and will be consigned to torment until the time of judgment.
Early Christianity, with its roots in Judaism, favored burial. But the resurrection of Jesus may have provided an additional incentive.
There have been some authors who have suggested that the story of Jesus arising from the tomb after the crucifixion was a sort of a spiritual model, and that people wanted to follow that and to be buried as Jesus had been entombed.
Christian belief emphasizes the concept of resurrection, when all humanity will be physically restored for a judgment day. Early Christians recognized that God could resurrect from ashes as well as from a burial. But the enemies of Christianity did not make that distinction, with a hideous result. They mocked Christian belief with the method they used to kill Christian believers.
Many of the early Christian martyrs were burned alive, and the reason they were burned was to some extent as a critique of the Christian view of the resurrection of the body. You think your body's going to be raised, well, we're going to burn it and there won't be anything left.
Not surprisingly, Christian sentiment hardened against cremation. The practice was largely condemned in the West for nearly 2,000 years. Then, in 1876, in the United States, the ban against cremation was challenged.
It came mostly with radical religionists, with free thinkers, with some agnostics, some atheists, some theosophists, and even some Buddhists. They didn't think that Christianity was sufficiently tolerant, and they didn't like a lot of doctrines in Christianity. And so cremation was for them a way to act out in practice their unorthodox religious views.
In a spirit of progress in science, the bodies were not burned on open pyres. They were cremated in closed ovens, much as they are today. But what is now routine was shocking front-page news in 1876. A reminder that all rituals can only be understood in the context of their time and place. The modern Western world tends to try to control nature and overcome it. Traditional cultures, though, often seek harmony with nature. Native Americans and others often left the departed exposed to the elements. This was an acceptance of the natural process of decay, a hastening of the return of dust to dust. In Tibet, a timeless tradition takes exposure to the natural elements a step further. It may seem grotesque and grisly until it is understood.
The Tibetans, because of their theological beliefs, view the body as basically a container. It has no worth whatsoever, no spiritual worth.
This rare film captures a ceremony usually forbidden to outsiders. It is known as the sky burial. The deceased is carried to a hill outside the village to a spot dense with holy flags. The flags are covered with prayers carried to heaven by the wind. The prayers and the horns summon creatures shunned by most of the world, vultures. They swoop in to feed, as they have here for countless centuries.
Ultimately, all bodies, whether they are buried or whether they are cremated or whatever their disposition, return to nature anyway. So in this case, it is simply providing benefit to the food chain.
Thus, the body is returned to nature, where it belongs, while the soul travels on to its destiny. There have been cultures, though, which valued the body so highly that their death rites culminated in a feast of human flesh. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus records how a people of northern Europe called the Isidonians practiced their form of cannibalism.
When a man's father dies, all the near relatives bring sheep to the house, which are sacrificed, and their flesh cut into pieces, while at the same time the dead body undergoes the like treatment. The two sorts of flesh are afterwards mixed together, and the whole served up at a banquet. Herodotus, Book 4, verse 26.
In some parts of the world, cannibalism continued well into modern times. Among the Gimi people of New Guinea, women and children routinely ate the corpses of deceased males. They did this in order to acquire the dignity and wisdom of the dead man. To refrain from eating his flesh would be to insult his memory. The custom ended only in the 1960s, partly because of a deadly nerve disease called kuru. The illness was spread by eating the brains of people infected with it. It seems unlikely that cannibalism will ever again be part of death rites anywhere. Only days before, he was a husband, a father, and the vibrant leader of a nation. John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. With his funeral, we acknowledge that he is gone, and gone forever. But what would happen if we refused to respect the boundary that ritual marks between life and death? Ancient wisdom warns of the futility of trying to reverse the natural order. In Greek mythology, the message that to be human is to accept death is told through the story of Orpheus, whose music has the power to charm the animals. He loves a forest nymph named Eurydice and is devastated when she dies. So great is his love, he dares to enter the underworld of death, determined to bring her back. He plays for the gods of the underworld, and the magic of his music makes them relent. They will let him lead Eurydice back to life, but he is warned he must not turn to look at her until they are free.
As he almost nears the mouth of the dark tunnel to the underworld, he is overcome with something so very human. And I think we all stand there saying, Orpheus, don't do it. But he does. And I don't know that any of us could do any different. We must look and see. Of course, as he does look back, Eurydice, who was following him, falls back to her fate. And he's lost. He's lost her.
The story reminds us of the finality of death. But sometimes the loss can be postponed. Sometimes it must be. It is ritual that can accomplish this by redefining reality. Among the Toraja people of Indonesia, the body may be stiff and cold, but it is not dead until ritual says it is. A funeral here involves the entire community, and members of the extended family gather from far distant villages. The elaborate preparations include the carving and careful grooming of an effigy of the deceased. Months will pass before the funeral can take place.
So what they simply do is to socially say that the dead person is not dead, and they will then move the body perhaps to one of the rear bedrooms and open the windows, knowing that the body will begin to decompose. Somebody will say, should we invite grandfather to the table for dinner? And someone else will say, oh no, grandfather's not feeling too well tonight. I'll take some dinner back to him. So they will carry some food back and then return it to the table saying, grandfather didn't feel like eating this evening. So then they will go about their business carrying on this charade as if the grandfather is in fact still alive.
Only when all is ready and proper do the Toraja carry the deceased to the place of burial. Even after the passage into death, in almost every culture, those who mourn the departed try to hold on to them through memory. For some, a simple grave. For others, an eternal work of art. The memory of a beloved wife is preserved by one of the world's most beautiful buildings. The Taj Mahal is a tomb, the final resting place of a queen called Mumtaz, the Exalted One. She died in childbirth in 1631. Her husband, Shah Jahan, mourned her loss to the end of his days, until he himself was laid beside her. The Taj Mahal keeps her memory alive and reminds all who see it that perfect love is possible. Memory of the dead can be put to many uses. Strangely, a regime that outlawed religious worship used the body of its leader as a symbol of its power. In Moscow, in Red Square, visitors still stand in line to see the embalmed remains of Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union. His corpse has outlasted the tyranny he created. A much older and more widespread tradition uses the dead to perpetuate memory and meaning. This is the preserved head of a saint who died 600 years ago, St. Catherine. It is displayed on the altar of the Church of St. Dominic in Siena, Italy. The sacred relic helps the faithful remember and reflect on a life that was holy. That function is not unique. Catholic churches throughout the world, great and small, contain some fragment of the body of a saint. Usually, it is a small piece of bone, interred beneath the altar or embedded in a stone upon it. Thus, a cycle is completed as the dead add meaning to the rituals of life.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Death presents a timeless paradox. We grieve the loss of loved ones, but dread the possibility of their return. Haunting ghosts and restless spirits are an ancient fear. Rest in peace has always been a benediction for the dead and the living.
We're sorry and bereaved that they've gone, but we don't like being revisited very often. And the idea of the ghost or the haunting, the sense of mystery and fear that comes when the spirit continues to linger in a place, I think that threatens us worldwide, because as much as anything, it's the notion that the door's still open, the boundaries are still unclear, and that there's passage back and forth.
Again, it is prehistoric ritual that supplies crucial evidence about the origins of belief. Discovered in caves in the southwest of France, the bodies are in the fetal position. They're also tied, as though to keep them from escaping.
The bodies buried there were frequently bound, tied in a kind of a fetal position. And this suggests that they had some concern about the individuals coming back or being a bother or perhaps bringing bad luck or something.
Fear of the dead has endured the countless centuries since prehistoric times. Halloween, even in its present form, acknowledges that the dead can return and will do mischief if they're not placated with offerings.
Trick or treat!
In Mexico, the ancient custom continues as El Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Feasts are laid in homes where the dead are expected for a visit. The rituals of El Dia de los Muertos make light of death and mocks him. We need not be afraid, for if spirits can return, then death doesn't really kill. And this is the message that lies at the heart of all death rituals. Whatever forms they take, they assure us life survives the failure of the flesh.
We can invent art, we can make up song and dance, we can tell ourselves almost any story about ourselves and come to believe it. But the reality of the corpse, the reality of the end of life, that can only be confronted, I think, by an act of imagination.
But is the concept of life beyond the flesh only a dream? All rituals have ancient roots. The prehistoric people who began them lived intimately with nature. For them, there was meaning in every shift and sign, to every movement, in every stillness and every shadow. What did our earliest ancestors see or sense or hear that made them believe life continues beyond the grave? It may have been the sun rising each dawn to break the darkness. It may have been the changing seasons, new blooms emerging from branches that had seemed dead. Perhaps rebirth and immortality was simply obvious to them. The poet William Wordsworth thought each of us is born with knowledge which fades as we grow older.
There was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light. Wordsworth, Intimations of Immortality.
In prehistoric times, when humans were new upon the earth, perhaps they had a knowledge we have lost. Is it possible that they passed that knowledge down to us as faith, embedded in the rituals of death? This is only speculation, and not everyone agrees.
Death was a mystery 44,000 years ago to the people that made those early burials. They developed death customs to try and deal with those mysteries. We are still trying to deal with the mysteries, and after all that time period, we are not one iota closer to understanding the basic mystery, and that is, what is death?
But of course, this is one question that will be answered for each of us sooner or later, conclusively.